Thank you, Susie, and thanks to Bright Futures for bringing me here. For the first time, I've been living in France, in Paris, for the past 24 years, and never been here before, so it's really a pleasure for me to discover beautiful Guernsey. So we'll be talking here a little bit about what we see at the OECD are the emerging big issues in the labor market and what should be, or what we think should be, the main responses from a workforce development, but also economic development perspective. So how is the world of work changing? And we've heard a lot already this morning about this. I mean, the biggest thing that we're seeing is the fact that the use of technology is increasing in the workplace. You can look at this from various angles. Here we're looking at the ICT technology, the capital services in its investment in ICT technology in the workplace per hour worked. So basically it's the amount of money that employers are putting into software and hardware for each working hour in the company. And this has doubled or tripled or quadrupled depending on the countries you're looking at. We talked about robots this morning. Every year we are adding in the workplace across the OECD hundreds of thousands of robots, about 400,000 nowadays, and this is bound to increase. The cost of robot is also diminishing, and it's interesting to know that in China, 5 years ago, it cost on average 5 years of the annual salary of a worker to pay back one robot, and last year it was 1.5. We estimate that next year it will be 1 year of salary to pay back for one robot. So even in emerging economies, automation is really advancing very, very fastly. Of course, you also have all the jobs in Uber and everything you can get delivered to your house, which is changing a little bit the labor market. We are probably exaggerating a little bit not the impact, but the amount of people working in non-standard employment contracts associated with the platform industry. However, we have to keep in mind that the working conditions are not the same. And so we have to incorporate that into our labor market thinking. So will these changes have an impact on jobs? Of course, they will. And I'm sure many of you have heard the estimates of saying that 50% of jobs would be destroyed due to automation in the future, 50%, 40%. At the OECD, we think this is a bit exaggerated. We've estimated that about 14% of all the jobs would be likely to be suppressed in the future due to automation over the next decades. However, a lot more jobs will change massively, but I will come back to that later. It's important to see that the risk of automation and the risk that automation creates for jobs is not the same across countries. So we've just estimated at the OECD the difference between regions within the same country in terms of the risk of automation. And we found that in some countries, the spread is very significant, like 10 or 15 percentage points between the risk of job destruction in some region and the risk of job destruction in another region. This is the case for France, for example, for Spain, a little bit less for the UK. Although here we're looking at the big regions. We're looking at Scotland, Northern Ireland, for example, the Greater London area. So if we were to go deeper, at county level, probably we would see a much bigger spread between the risk of automation across regions. Now, what's interesting is that when you put all the regions together at the OECD, we find that actually the vast majority of regions are doing things well. They are creating jobs, net jobs, so there's more job creation than job destruction. And these jobs are predominantly in low-risk occupations. That means that the jobs are created, which is good in the short term, but also these are jobs that can be sustained in the longer term. However, you have about 10% regions which are creating jobs also, but predominantly in riskier occupations, so these jobs can be destroyed in the future. You also have a significant chunk of regions which are destroying jobs. So they are creating but destroying jobs more than they create them. But these jobs that are at low risk of occupation, which means that these regions are probably going through a process which is a healthy one, which is that they are transforming their economy, perhaps digitalizing it, which means that the jobs that they create are perhaps likely to be sustained in the future. But you also have a share of regions which are creating jobs, destroying jobs, but the good jobs. So they are going in the wrong direction. So depending on where you are, it can give you an idea about what should be the broad strategy that you could use in your region. So if you are creating jobs and these jobs are at low risk of destruction, then there's not much to do. You can just facilitate transition from high risk occupation to low risk occupation. If you are creating jobs, but these are high risk jobs, but maybe you need to work not on the labor market side, but more on the economy and facilitate structural adjustment and help regions to become more productive and digital, for example. And if you are in a region which is losing high-risk jobs, which means that these regions are going through a painful process, you need to facilitate the transition on the labor market. If the region is losing jobs, but good jobs at low risk of occupation, it means that you need to work more, at the same time on the labor market side, facilitating transition, but also helping the economy to become more digital or more productive. Now, going back to this picture, where you have a modest share of jobs which are likely to be destroyed, but at the same time, you get a lot more jobs. There's a massive amount of jobs which will be changing over the next decades, because it's not normally jobs that you automate, it is tasks. And so these tasks can be found in many different occupations. And what we find is that most occupation will change massively over the next decades, because the risk of automation is spread around tasks which are incorporated into many occupations. And what's the result from that? Well, we see the impact from these changes today in the labor market. And the best way of looking at all these changes in one shot is to look at job polarization. So job polarization is not a new thing. It has been going on for 2 decades approximately due to globalization, technological progress. But automation and digitalization is just exacerbating this thing, which is very important. So you have a decreasing demand for middle-skilled workers whose tasks can be often more easily automatable. But at the same time, you have a big demand for high-skilled jobs and also a significant demand for low-skilled occupations, which are often not so easy to digitalize or to automate, because these are proximity services. These are jobs in the hospitality industry, jobs into service, the things so that you can get delivered and so on. So these are jobs which are not necessarily paying so much, but these are jobs that we require a lot more in many economies. And this brings a number of challenges for our workforce development system. So what are those things that we need to think about when we rethink our education, our skills, and employment system? And many of these things have been discussed here, so they will resonate a lot with you. Well, first of all, we need to supply the skills that the economy needs. And that's not easy. Our education system everywhere finds it very difficult to supply the skills, especially the high skills, that are in great demand today. And this is dramatic because in a local economy, if you don't have those skills, it's very difficult to seize the economic opportunities that are possible to take and exploit, as those that have been mentioned here in the case of currency. The second very important challenge is the need to upgrade the skills of existing workers, and mainly the middle skilled workers. So you saw the decreasing demand for middle skilled workers. So how do we help them to acquire the skills that would help them to get one of those high-paying jobs and not instead compete with the low-skilled workers for the low-paid jobs? Because this is the risk that we are facing. If we fail to help the middle-skilled workers to get the skills that would help them to get a better job, they will instead compete and crowd out the market for low-paid jobs. And this is what's happening right now. And this may be one of the reasons why salaries are not increasing, inflation is not increasing. So it's dampening, working conditions and wages, and that's very important to address. And the third important challenge is, even if we were able to supply the skills that the economy needs, even if we were able to upgrade the skills of the middle-skilled workers, we might not be able to significantly improve living conditions or working conditions and salaries and job quality. It's not enough to supply skills. We also need to make sure that those skills are fully used so that we translate them into higher productivity, greater resilience in our local economies, and better quality jobs. And this is something that is right now not happening. There are many obstacles for this, and I will just get to some of these issues with you now. So first of all, the first challenge, not the main one, but the first one is, how do we supply the skills that the economy needs? And as I was saying, our education system is really struggling to supply those skills at this moment. From our study of adult skills, we find that across the OECD, on average, 60% of the working age population has poor IT problem-solving skills. So problem-solving using IT. This is really a bad result. This is something that our education system is really finding it difficult to address. But also 23% of the working age population, on average across countries, has poor numeracy skills, and 20% poor literacy skills. So this is really creating a problem for our economies, which have issues that they are facing. And at the same time, employers complain that they cannot find the skills that they need. This is something that is generalized across the OECD. About 35% of employers find it difficult to get the skills that they need. We've highlighted France and the UK. In the UK, it seems to be less of a problem, although it was in 2015, and things have changed since then. So what are the main lessons that we draw from our work at the OECD on how to address that? Well, first of all, of course, we will need to make the education system more responsive to the needs that the labor market is expressing. Well, it's all well and good to say that, but at the local level, sometimes it's very difficult to have any influence on the education system. Perhaps in Guernsey, there is some room for maneuver that you can use, because I think some of the things are taken from the UK system, but there's some things that can change or differ if you use all the leeway that you can get. But this is a very serious problem. Across the OECD, sometimes from the moment when you identify a new need in the labor market, and by the time you have translated those needs into a new curriculum and new delivery of training, maybe a time span of 7 or 8 years has passed. So it's very slow to react. So one-size-fits-all approaches to workforce development do not work. It's very important at the local level or the regional level to look at what are those needs. So there's no need to put people into, if you have unemployed people, to put them into, job experience, for example, if there's a new economic opportunity that arises and you need to train people. So you need to have this flexibility to modify the policy mix between employment programs, education, and other labor market tools. So it's very important to have flexibility in the management of education and training, and also labor market policies. So this is what we are telling national governments, that they need to inject more flexibility. But you cannot wait for that. If you have some possibilities to use the leeway that you have, so to modify the policy mix, you need to use it. It's very important. Stimulating apprenticeship is very important. There's a lot that can be done regionally or locally. We've seen many cases where mayors can really change the profile or the awareness of apprenticeship and convince employers to use that more. In the UK, for example, many mayors have exerted their leadership to have an impact on apprenticeship, and in other countries as well. So many things can be really done locally or regionally. Now, the second important challenge is, how do you help the middle-skilled workers to acquire the skills that would help them to get one of those high-paying jobs? This is very difficult and not impossible, but we haven't seen many very successful stories across the OECD. For decades, we have, and including at the OECD, talked about the need for lifelong learning. But this has largely remained rhetorical in many countries, because it's very difficult to convince people, employers, to let their workers to undertake training, also to convince people who sometimes are not paid very highly, to take some time off and go back to school. And sometimes there are many obstacles in terms of your own capacity to juggle with many things in your life and to undertake training. So this is something which is to some extent new, to focus on the middle-skilled workers. However, for many years, we have been working on how to upgrade the skills of the low-skilled workers into the labor market. And there we have some lessons that we can draw from. So one of the main things is also to make sure that the training is very flexible and modulable, in order to fit some of the obstacles that are faced by by workers, by local companies. Engaging employers is very important. It's very key. It's something that I'm sure Bright Futures is already doing and can do in the future. It's very important to be able to engage with employers to understand what are the obstacles for engaging in training. What we've seen in many countries is some intermediaries can play a very useful role to help convince the employers and the employees to try training. And the idea here is we've seen that in Canada with community colleges, tailoring a test for companies and for employees, which could be passed voluntarily by employees who would like to see if they have skills gap that they would like that they could correct, and it could give them a longer career path, or they could see what would be the benefit from undertaking some training. The employer also can see this way what they would gain from engaging in training. So it's a way for stakeholders to identify for themselves what would be their interest in undertaking training. Because there's always a share of risk. For employers, you can train people who will move to another company or to another island. For employees, you take risk because you are not maybe as, you're not as present in the firm, or you also have other issues in your life, which makes it that there's a difficulty in all that. So it's very important to think about these ways of, again, helping people to understand what's in it for them in doing it. So intermediaries is very important. Working with SMEs is very important, because SMEs have very, small capacities, often in terms of human resource management and vocational and training in their companies. Now, the third and probably the most important challenge is how to make sure that the skills that we produce are fully used. Because we see across the OECD that it's not the case. Firms often try to stay competitive not by investing, but by cutting costs. It makes sense for them. Why does it make sense for them? because nowadays, if living conditions are not increasing, people don't spend more on products. They would rather spend less. So it's a sort of vicious circle. So there's not a lot of incentive for employers really to work with their workforce and to look for innovation within the workforce, which could lead to new product, new processes, new work organizations, which again would entail risks when you want to minimize risk. So we have to break this vicious circle, which is very important. And here we can see why it's important for employees to have a strategy to better use the skills in the workplace. So here we're looking at the impact of 3 things on the average wage of workers. The blue bars indicate the impact of the years of education. So simply, it's the correlation between your years of education and your wage on average across a range of OECD countries. So you see that it's an important factor. The second thing, if you look at the black dots, it shows the impact of proficiency in doing things. So how good you are doing things will lead to an increased wage. So you see that there is an impact here, which is not insignificant. But what's interesting is the blue diamonds. It shows the impact of the use of skills in the workplace. So how intense is the use of your skills in the workplace, and what's the impact on the average salary of workers? And here we're looking at the use of reading skills. So the more you use your skills, the more on average it has an impact on salaries. And of course, this has an impact on the productivity of countries. So here we're looking at the correlation between not the years of education, not qualifications, not proficiency. We're looking simply at the correlation between the use of reading skills in the workplace on average in each country and the productivity of countries. And you see that there is a direct and positive relationship. So it's not enough just to supply skills. It's very important, obviously, but you need to use them. So suppose you only, in Guernsey, for example, you just invest in skills, so you put all your money into education and training, which is good, which we need to do, of course. But the demand for skills remains low, but then you risk being in a skills surplus area, which means that either people are unemployed because they cannot find suitable jobs, or they may be underemployed, overqualified, or they may be leaving to another country or another region where they could find a job which is more, commensurate to the skills that they have. But likewise, if you have a strong demand for skills, but you don't have the skills, you don't have enough of the skills that you need in your area, you may end up with a skills deficit. So it's very important to take an integrated approach to look both at the supply and the demand for skills, and to make sure that as you build the skills in your area by investing into education and training, you also have a strategy for using those skills fully, which means that you may need to do more with your local industries and local firms, and perhaps look at what are their productivity gaps, are the work production processes and the work organization modernized enough? Do you need to do more to put the workers at the center of the innovation process in firms? And we know it's difficult, again, for small and medium-sized enterprises, which often don't even have a human resource department. So how do you want them to also think in terms of, well, I need my employees to innovate more and to change the processes in my firm? This is a very difficult question. So it's very important, again, it's very useful to know where you're here. I don't know where you think Guernsey would be. Well, certainly the demand is certainly high, so you may be in an area of skills deficit. That would not be surprising. We don't have data for areas as small as Guernsey, Ireland, of course. But what we managed to do is to have data at the level of local economies. And here we put the two neighboring countries. And if you look at neighboring regions. So Cotentin here is in a low skills trap, which means that they may not have a lot of unemployment, but the supply of skills is low. Also, the demand is low, so quality of jobs is probably quite low. So there's a lot of things to do there. And if we look just across the channel, well, you are in a sort of skills surplus area. You have good universities, and perhaps the quality of jobs is not high enough. Those jobs are not paying enough, so people go to other regions. So what can you do? So we often talk about integrating workforce development and economic development. This is really a case in point why you need to have a strategy for doing that. There's a lot of things that can be done, and it can be done best at the local level where you have a proximity between the stakeholders, the agencies, and also with the companies, of course. So it's very important to spot the high turnover companies, and this is something that the public employment services can do. Often the employment services, what they are asked to do is just to churn out the unemployed as quickly as they can. So they're happy when there's a vacancy because they can place an unemployed person in that, in that job. But the problem is that when you have companies which have these frequent, vacancies, this may be a signal that is, it's not productive. Even if you put people into this job, the job will be free again because the person will have left. So maybe it's a more intelligent use of public resources if we work with this company in a different way. And instead of placing a person into it, it's important to see what are the problems. So other stakeholders can help to understand what the problems are. Colleges and training institutions can first do a diagnostic on the skills use and identify the gaps, and maybe there's a case in point for further training or for training the managers, which is also a possibility. But then perhaps enterprise specialists can also make a more in-depth diagnostic and identify if the company needs more investment, more modernization, and if something needs to be changed in the work organization. To have a local university can be very useful. I know you don't have one in Guernsey, but should there be a possibility to bring a branch here, that would be very important. But it's not because you have a university that it will solve the problem. Many universities today, they think of themselves in a global game and not in a local one. And that's really a pity because there's a lot that can be done in terms of not only technology transfer and help to, bringing new innovations to companies, but also working with the local economic fabric and ensuring that there is also applied research, not only fundamental one, but applied research, which can be useful for the local companies and the small companies. There are many examples of this happening. It depends a lot on the governance of universities, of course. So in many universities, they are just accountable to their own, constituencies, and they don't involve employers. If you go to some provinces in Canada, you have community colleges and universities which have employers on their board. That's very useful because it leads them to think in terms of what are the needs of the local community and how we can help. More broadly, it's very important to have a strategy which leads to, takes a path towards a high-skill equilibrium, which means, looking both at the supply and the demand side. You may already be in a high-skill equilibrium here, but compared to what? You wouldn't compare yourself to Cornwall or to Cotentin, but you would probably compare yourself with Singapore. So this is very important to continue seeing this as a big challenge. And this is really such a strategy that can lead you to where you want to be in terms of making the place more attractive with better quality jobs, a thriving economy, and a more diversified one. So really when people talk about, we need to work in partnership, yeah, well, of course, everybody wants to be working in partnerships, and sometimes we don't know what's behind. But this is a real explanation, a real rationale, and a real underpinning for working in partnership. Because if you want to address the issues that are coming to us from the changing labor market and the changing economy, you really need to bring those pieces together. Employment services, labor market policy, training and education and economic development. You need to lead each of these actors to do more than what's in their requirement or cahier des charges or in their toolbox. They need to invent and use new tools. Training needs to do more than just trying to have a great connection with enterprises. We need to find how we can make a better use of skills in the workplace. Employment services need to do more than just spending the money on their programs and connecting job seekers with vacancies. They need to work also with the economic development perspective in mind. And likewise, economic developers need to think from a human resource perspective also. That's very important. So that's the true meaning of partnership today, and it can lead to great results. And if Guernsey is leading initiatives in this area, it would be great for the OECD to track this and monitor the results and maybe use it as a model for other places going forward. So thank you very much.